Single dad used sign language at Christmas dinner. The CEO's deaf daughter lit up with a smile. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much! Now, back to Ethan Cole. The dining room glowed with soft Christmas lights and polished silverware, the kind of place where crystal glasses clinked gently and laughter carried just a little too confidently across the table, and Ethan Cole stood near the edge of it all with his 8-year-old daughter holding his hand, feeling every inch like a guest who had wandered into the wrong story. He wore a modest navy blazer he'd owned for nearly a decade, sleeves brushed smooth more times than he could count, and his shoes were clean but tired, the soles thin from years of standing on job sites and concrete floors. Around him, conversations flowed about mergers, stock prices, winter homes measured in thousands of square feet, and holiday trips counted in thousands of miles, and Ethan listened politely, nodding when someone made eye contact, offering quiet smiles that rarely invited follow-up questions. He wasn't offended by the distance, he was used to it. Being a single dad had taught him how to occupy space without demanding it, how to exist with dignity even when the room seemed designed for louder voices. His daughter Lily stayed close, her small fingers wrapped around his, eyes wide as she took in the towering tree near the window, decorated in gold and white ornaments that shimmered like stars, and the long table set for dinner with place cards written in elegant script. Ethan had come because Lily's school choir had been invited to sing at the company's holiday dinner, and a last-minute change meant parents were asked to attend as well, and he had said yes without hesitation, even though walking into a CEO's Christmas dinner wasn't exactly where he imagined himself on a cold December evening. As servers moved gracefully between guests, carrying plates and refilling glasses, Ethan noticed a little girl seated a few chairs away from the head of the table, her posture careful, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes following faces instead of voices. She looked to be around 10, dark hair pulled back with a simple ribbon, and while everyone else leaned into conversation, she remained quiet, detached, as if the noise washed around her without ever reaching in. Ethan recognized that look instantly, not from his own child, but from memory, a life he once shared with someone who understood silence differently than most. Years ago, before life narrowed and simplified, before it taught him how fragile good things could be, his wife had been a speech therapist who specialized in working with deaf children, and in the evenings, their small living room would fill with laughter and gentle concentration as she practiced sign language with students and sometimes with Ethan himself, teaching him patiently, reminding him that communication wasn't about sound, but about being seen. That world had faded after she passed, folded away like old photographs, but the knowledge had stayed with him, resting quietly in his hands. As the guests settled into their seats and the hum of conversation swelled, the little girl glanced up again, her gaze drifting toward Ethan and Lily, curious but cautious, and for a moment their eyes met. Ethan felt a familiar pull, not obligation, not pity, just recognition. He didn't know who she was, didn't know that the woman at the head of the table was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, didn't know anything about corporate empires or boardrooms. He only knew what it felt like to be invisible in a room full of people. Lily tugged his sleeve and whispered that she was hungry, and Ethan smiled down at her, reassuring, steady, the way he always was. As the first course was served and laughter rose again, louder now, he noticed the little girl's shoulders tense, her smile polite but practiced, and something in him shifted. This wasn't a decision made with courage or fear, it was instinct, the kind that comes from years of loving quietly and losing deeply. He adjusted his chair slightly, turning just enough so he was within her line of sight, and when she looked over again, he offered a gentle smile and lifted his hands, moving them slowly, deliberately, signing a simple question he hadn't used in years, one that felt as natural as breathing, asking if she was enjoying Christmas dinner. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, and the room continued on in its confident rhythm, unaware of the small miracle forming at the edge of the table. Then the girl's eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition, and her face transformed in a way that couldn't be rehearsed or bought or commanded, lighting up with a pure, unguarded smile that seemed to glow brighter than the decorations themselves. And in that quiet exchange, before anyone else noticed, the tone of the entire night began to change. The smile stayed with Ethan longer than he expected, lingering in the air between them like a small light no one else had noticed yet, And as the servers cleared the first plates and the low murmur of conversation shifted toward business talk and holiday plans, he slowly lowered his hands, careful not to draw attention, returning them to his lap as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had changed. The little girl, Emma, sat taller now, her shoulders no longer drawn inward, her eyes alive with curiosity as she signed back, her movements tentative but eager, asking his name, asking if he knew sign language well, asking questions that came not from politeness but from relief. Ethan answered gently, keeping his gestures simple, telling her his name was Ethan, that he learned years ago, that he was glad to meet her, and each response brought another flicker of joy across her face. Lily watched the exchange with quiet fascination, her gaze moving between her father's hands and Emma's expressions, sensing without fully understanding that this moment mattered. Around them, forks clinked against china, laughter rose and fell, and someone at the far end of the table made a joke that drew polite applause, but none of it touched the small circle forming between the four hands moving carefully in the warm glow of Christmas lights. Ethan was aware, dimly, of eyes beginning to drift their way, not sharply, not yet, just passing glances from guests who noticed movement where there had been stillness before. He kept his posture relaxed, his presence modest, the way he had learned to be after years of standing quietly on the margins of louder lives. He did not look toward the head of the table, did not know that Margaret Huxley had paused mid-sentence, her attention caught by something she could not immediately name, only the unfamiliar sight of her daughter smiling in a way she had not seen in months. Not the polite smile used for photos or meetings, but something open and unguarded. Margaret followed the line of her daughter's gaze and saw Ethan, his hands moving slowly, respectfully, and a strange stillness settled over her, the kind that arrives when something deeply personal interrupts the flow of a carefully managed world. She did not interrupt. She simply watched. Ethan signed another sentence, telling Emma that Christmas could be loud sometimes, that it was all right to feel overwhelmed, and Emma laughed silently, covering her mouth with her hand, then signed back that it was always loud for her, that people forgot she could not hear, that sometimes they forgot she was there at all. The words landed softly but firmly in Ethan's chest, familiar in a way that surprised him, and he nodded, acknowledging without pity, telling her that being quiet did not mean being invisible. Not to the people who were paying attention. Lily leaned closer, whispering to her father that Emma seemed nice, and Ethan smiled at his daughter, pride and tenderness crossing his face, before signing to Emma that Lily loved Christmas songs and hot chocolate, and Emma responded with a grin, signing that she liked snow globes and lights. It was simple, ordinary conversation, the kind most people took for granted, but here it carried the weight of something restored. A woman seated nearby cleared her throat, glancing between Ethan and Emma with curiosity that bordered on suspicion, and Ethan felt the familiar instinct to retreat, to make himself smaller, but Emma reached out then, lightly touching his sleeve, a silent request for him to stay, and he did. At the head of the table, Margaret finally stood, her movement subtle but enough to draw attention, and the room quieted slightly as she raised her glass to make a brief toast about gratitude and family, her voice steady even as her eyes kept drifting back to her daughter. When she finished, the guests returned to their conversations, but the air felt different now, charged with something unspoken. Ethan felt it too, though he could not have named it, only sensing that the small, kind choice he had made without thinking was beginning to ripple outward, slow and inevitable. And as he met Emma's eyes again and signed one more gentle sentence, asking if she was enjoying the lights, he had no idea that this quiet moment would soon reshape far more than just one Christmas dinner. The smile stayed with Ethan longer than he expected, lingering in the air between them like a small light no one else had noticed yet, and as the servers cleared the first plates and the low murmur of conversation shifted toward business talk and holiday plans, he slowly lowered his hands, careful not to draw attention, returning them to his lap as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had changed. The little girl, Emma, sat taller now, her shoulders no longer drawn inward, her eyes alive with curiosity as she signed back, her movements tentative but eager, asking his name, asking if he knew sign language well, asking questions that came not from politeness but from relief. Ethan answered gently, keeping his gestures simple, telling her his name was Ethan, that he learned years ago, that he was glad to meet her, and each response brought another flicker of joy across her face. Lily watched the exchange with quiet fascination, her gaze moving between her father's hands and Emma's expressions, sensing without fully understanding that this moment mattered. Around them, forks clinked against china, laughter rose and fell, and someone at the far end of the table made a joke that drew polite applause, but none of it touched the small circle forming between the four hands moving carefully in the warm glow of Christmas lights. Ethan was aware, dimly, of eyes beginning to drift their way, not sharply, not yet, just passing glances from guests who noticed movement where there had been stillness before. He kept his posture relaxed, his presence modest, the way he had learned to be after years of standing quietly on the margins of louder lives. He did not look toward the head of the table, did not know that Margaret Huxley had paused mid-sentence, her attention caught by something she could not immediately name, only the unfamiliar sight of her daughter smiling in a way she had not seen in months. Not the polite smile used for photos or meetings, but something open and unguarded. Margaret followed the line of her daughter's gaze and saw Ethan, his hands moving slowly, respectfully, and a strange stillness settled over her, the kind that arrives when something deeply personal interrupts the flow of a carefully managed world. She did not interrupt. She simply watched. Ethan signed another sentence, telling Emma that Christmas could be loud sometimes, that it was all right to feel overwhelmed, and Emma laughed silently, covering her mouth with her hand, then signed back that it was always loud for her, that people forgot she could not hear, that sometimes they forgot she was there at all. The words landed softly but firmly in Ethan's chest, familiar in a way that surprised him, and he nodded, acknowledging without pity, telling her that being quiet did not mean being invisible, not to the people who were paying attention. Lily leaned closer, whispering to her father that Emma seemed nice, and Ethan smiled at his daughter, pride and tenderness crossing his face, before signing to Emma that Lily loved Christmas songs and hot chocolate, and Emma responded with a grin, signing that she liked snow globes and lights. It was simple, ordinary conversation, the kind most people took for granted, but here it carried the weight of something restored. A woman seated nearby cleared her throat, glancing between Ethan and Emma with curiosity that bordered on suspicion, and Ethan felt the familiar instinct to retreat, to make himself smaller, but Emma reached out then, lightly touching his sleeve, a silent request for him to stay, and he did. At the head of the table, Margaret finally stood, her movement subtle, but enough to draw attention, and the room quieted slightly as she raised her glass to make a brief toast about gratitude and family, her voice steady even as her eyes kept drifting back to her daughter. When she finished, the guests returned to their conversations, but the air felt different now, charged with something unspoken. Ethan felt it too, though he could not have named it, only sensing that the small, kind choice he had made without thinking was beginning to ripple outward, slow and inevitable. And as he met Emma's eyes again and signed one more gentle sentence, asking if she was enjoying the lights, he had no idea that this quiet moment would soon reshape far more than just one Christmas dinner. As dessert plates arrived and the scent of cinnamon and baked apples settled over the table, the room eased into that familiar late-evening rhythm where conversations softened and shoulders relaxed, and yet beneath that calm, something subtle continued to shift. Ethan felt it in the way Emma kept glancing toward him, her attention no longer drifting away, but anchored, as if she had finally found a place where she did not have to work so hard to belong. He signed slowly, asking if she liked the dessert, and she laughed again, nodding eagerly, signing back that it was her favorite, that her mother always made sure there was something sweet for everyone, even if she herself did not always stay long enough to enjoy it. The words were simple, but Ethan sensed the quiet ache beneath them, the familiar distance between a parent consumed by responsibility and a child longing for connection. He answered carefully, telling Emma that it was good her mother cared, that sometimes love showed itself through effort, even when time was scarce, and Emma considered this, her smile softening into something thoughtful. Lily, emboldened now, leaned closer and asked her father quietly what they were saying, and Ethan explained in a low voice, making sure Emma could read his lips if she wished, that they were talking about favorite foods and Christmas lights, and Emma signed excitedly that she loved snow globes because they were silent but beautiful, and Lily's eyes lit up at that, nodding in agreement. A few seats away, a man in an expensive suit watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and disapproval, and he leaned toward his companion, whispering something that made her glance over as well. Ethan noticed the shift in their posture, the way attention sharpened, and instinctively he slowed his movements, making them smaller, less noticeable, the old habit of self-protection rising without invitation. But before he could withdraw, Emma signed again, asking if he came to many parties like this, and Ethan smiled gently, shaking his head, signing that he usually worked nights and weekends, that this was not his world, but that sometimes you found good moments in unexpected places. Emma's response was immediate and earnest. She signed that she was glad he came, that she did not like parties much because people talked at her instead of with her, and Ethan felt a quiet tightening in his chest, recognizing the truth of her words. At the head of the table, Margaret Huxley finally excused herself from a conversation with two board members, her movements composed but purposeful, and she began to make her way down the table, stopping briefly to greet guests, her eyes never leaving her daughter. As she approached, Ethan sensed her presence before he saw her, the way conversations dipped slightly around power, and he straightened unconsciously, prepared to apologize, to explain, to retreat if necessary. Margaret stopped beside Emma's chair and rested a hand lightly on her daughter's shoulder, signing something quickly and fluidly, and Ethan realized then that she too knew sign language, though she used it less naturally, her gestures practiced rather than lived. Emma looked up at her mother, her expression bright and animated, signing rapidly now, her hands moving with excitement as she explained that Ethan understood her, that he talked to her, that he asked questions, that he listened. Margaret's face changed in a way that only a parent could recognize, the professional polish slipping just enough to reveal surprise, gratitude, and something close to disbelief. She turned to Ethan then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time, and spoke softly, thanking him for including her daughter, her voice steady but touched with emotion. Ethan nodded respectfully, replying that it was no trouble at all, that Emma was easy to talk to, and he signed the last part as well, so Emma could see, so she would not feel spoken over. The surrounding guests had gone quiet now, forks paused midair, conversations suspended, drawn by something they did not fully understand but could not ignore. Ethan felt the weight of their attention, but he did not shrink this time. He remained still, present, his hands resting calmly, his expression open. Margaret glanced around the table, then back at her daughter, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, unaware that a simple act of kindness had already begun to redraw the lines between status and humanity, between noise and understanding, and between who belonged and who was finally seen. The silence that followed Margaret's words was not uncomfortable, but reflective, the kind that settles when something honest interrupts a carefully staged evening, and as guests slowly resumed their movements, Ethan felt the atmosphere around him shift from curiosity to something more restrained, more respectful. Margaret remained beside her daughter for a moment longer, her hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder as she signed another brief sentence, asking if Emma was comfortable, if she wanted anything, and Emma nodded, smiling up at her mother before turning back to Ethan with an eagerness that had not faded. She signed that she wanted to show him something, and before anyone could object, she carefully reached into a small bag hanging from the back of her chair and pulled out a snow globe, shaking it gently so the tiny flakes drifted slowly around a miniature winter scene. Ethan leaned in, his expression softening, and signed that it was beautiful, that he liked how quiet it was, how everything moved without noise, and Emma laughed again, nodding vigorously, clearly delighted that someone understood exactly what she loved about it. Lily watched closely, enchanted, and whispered that she had one at home too, and Emma's eyes widened as she signed back that maybe one day they could compare them, the simple possibility filling her with visible excitement. Around them, conversations restarted but did not quite regain their earlier volume, and a few guests continued to steal glances in their direction, trying to make sense of the connection forming where they had expected none. Ethan was aware of the attention now, aware of the unspoken questions about who he was and why he was here, but he felt strangely calm, anchored by the ordinary kindness of the moment. Margaret finally took her seat again, though she positioned herself closer to her daughter than before, and she watched the interaction with a focus that went beyond polite interest, as if she were witnessing something she had long suspected was missing but had never quite been able to name. She remembered countless dinners just like this one, beautifully arranged and efficiently managed, where Emma sat quietly at her side while conversations flowed past her like a river she could not enter, and she felt a pang of regret sharpened by the clarity of what she was seeing now. Ethan signed another question, asking Emma what she wanted to be when she grew up, and Emma hesitated, her hands hovering midair before she signed that she did not know yet, that people often assumed she would want to do something quiet, something small, and Ethan shook his head gently, signing that being quiet did not mean thinking small, that she could be anything she wanted, that her world was just as big as anyone else's. The sincerity of his words settled over the table like a warm blanket, and even those who did not understand the signs felt the weight of what was being shared. Lily squeezed her father's arm, pride shining in her eyes, and Ethan glanced at her briefly, reminded again of how easily children recognized goodness when it appeared. A server approached to offer coffee, hesitated when she saw the scene unfolding, then moved on without interrupting, and Ethan noticed how even small interactions were adjusting themselves around this unexpected center of gravity. Margaret took a slow breath, then stood once more, her chair scraping softly against the floor, and addressed the table with a calm authority that drew everyone's attention. She spoke about gratitude, about the season reminding them to slow down and notice one another, and though her words were measured, they carried a personal weight that surprised those who knew her only as a decisive executive. She thanked everyone for being there, then added, almost as an afterthought, that sometimes the most meaningful moments of the evening came from the simplest gestures, the ones that did not appear on any agenda. Her gaze rested briefly on Ethan as she said this, not with scrutiny, but with acknowledgement. Ethan nodded once, respectfully, feeling no need to respond aloud, and Emma beamed, clearly aware that something important had just happened, even if she did not yet understand its full shape. As Margaret sat down, the room exhaled, conversation returning with a softer tone, and Ethan signed one last gentle comment to Emma about the snow outside, telling her that it would probably be sticking soon, and Emma signed back that she hoped so. That snow made everything quieter. Ethan smiled at that, knowing exactly what she meant, and as he leaned back in his chair, he felt the quiet certainty that this Christmas dinner had already become something none of them would forget. Not because of who was in the room, but because of how one person had chosen to be present. The evening moved forward with a gentler pace now, as if the room itself had learned to breathe more quietly, and Ethan felt the tension he had carried into the dinner slowly loosen its grip. Coffee cups were refilled, a few guests stood to stretch or greet one another, and soft holiday music returned at a lower volume, no longer competing for attention. Emma remained turned toward Ethan, her hands resting on the table, her posture open, and she signed that she wished dinners could always be like this, calm and slow, without people rushing to the next thing. Ethan nodded, understanding more than she knew, and signed back that sometimes the best moments happen when no one was trying to impress anyone else. Lily swung her legs beneath her chair, content, humming softly to herself, and Ethan noticed how at ease she seemed, how naturally children adjusted when the world gave them space to be themselves. Across the table, the man in the expensive suit who had been whispering earlier finally spoke aloud, his tone polite but edged with curiosity, asking Margaret how Ethan knew sign language, the question landing with an audible shift in the room. A few heads turned fully now, attention focused, waiting for an explanation that fit neatly into their understanding of things. Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Ethan, giving him the choice, and that small gesture did not go unnoticed. Ethan cleared his throat softly, feeling the familiar instinct to minimize his story, to make it unremarkable. And he spoke simply, explaining that his late wife had been a speech therapist, that he had learned sign language to support her work and to help children feel understood, that it had been a long time but some things stayed with you. There was no drama in his voice, no attempt to elevate the story beyond what it was, and that honesty carried its own weight. The man nodded slowly, his earlier skepticism softened, and a woman nearby murmured something about how meaningful that was, though Ethan did not linger on their reactions. Emma watched him closely as he spoke, reading his expression, then signed that his wife must have been kind, and Ethan smiled, his eyes briefly distant, before signing back that she believed everyone deserved to be heard. Margaret felt a quiet ache at those words, recognizing the truth of them in a way that felt both affirming and challenging, and she wondered how many times she had assumed Emma was fine simply because she was well cared for. As the conversation drifted again, a server approached to announce that the evening was winding down, coats and gifts being brought forward, and guests began preparing to leave. Margaret stood and addressed the room one final time, thanking everyone for coming, wishing them a peaceful holiday, and as applause followed, she signed a few words to Emma that made her smile proudly. Ethan gathered Lily's coat, helping her into it with practiced ease, and prepared himself for the quiet return to their small apartment, already content with the night as it was. Before he could turn away, Margaret approached them, her demeanor composed but warmer than before, and thanked Ethan again, this time more personally, telling him that what he had done mattered, that it had given her daughter something she could not provide on her own. Ethan listened respectfully, nodding, and replied that it had been a privilege, that Emma had made the evening brighter for him too. Emma signed goodbye enthusiastically, asking if they might see each other again, and Ethan hesitated only a moment before signing that he hoped so, that sometimes the world had a way of bringing people together when they least expected it. Margaret took note of that answer, the quiet sincerity behind it, and something settled in her expression, a resolve forming that surprised even her. As coats were collected and the doors opened to the cold night air, snow beginning to fall in soft, steady flakes, Ethan stepped outside with Lily, the city lights reflecting off the white ground, and he felt a rare sense of fullness, not from recognition or reward, but from knowing that a simple act of kindness had traveled farther than he could see, planting a seed that would not be forgotten once the decorations came down and the noise returned. The drive home was quiet, snow tapping softly against the windshield as Ethan guided the car through familiar streets, Lily humming to herself in the back seat, her small hands clutching the program from the choir performance like a keepsake. The city looked different under the fresh layer of white, edges softened, noise muted, and Ethan felt the night settle into him the way it always did after a long day, a mixture of fatigue and calm acceptance. Lily broke the silence by asking if Emma had understood her when she smiled, and Ethan answered gently that understanding came in many forms, that sometimes it started with being willing to see someone. Lily nodded thoughtful, then said she hoped Emma liked snow as much as she did, and Ethan smiled, focusing on the road as the warmth of the car contrasted with the cold outside. Back at their apartment, modest and worn but clean, Ethan helped Lily with her coat and set water to boil for cocoa, the familiar routines grounding him. He did not expect the night to follow him further. Moments like that usually lived and ended quietly. Across town, however, Margaret stood by her window long after guests had left, watching the snowfall collect on the garden lights, Emma seated beside her with the snow globe resting on her knees. Emma signed that she felt happy and tired, that she liked the man who talked with his hands because he waited and did not rush, and Margaret listened, the words landing with a clarity that cut through years of assumptions. She signed back that she was glad, that she was proud of Emma, then added softly that sometimes adults forgot to slow down, a confession Emma accepted without judgment. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed, Margaret sat alone with her tablet, emails piling up unanswered as she replayed the evening in her mind, the way the room had shifted without announcement, the way dignity had entered quietly and changed everything. She searched for the school program, found Ethan Cole listed beneath Lily's name, and paused, not to investigate, but to remember, recognizing that respect did not require background checks or favors. The next morning arrived clear and cold, sunlight reflecting sharply off the snow, and Ethan walked Lily to school bundled in scarves, their breath forming small clouds as they talked about Christmas break. At work, the day unfolded as usual, tools clinking, fluorescent lights humming, coworkers trading holiday jokes, and Ethan returned to the rhythm he knew, the one that asked little and gave just enough. He did not mention the dinner, he never did with things that felt personal. Around midday, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, polite and brief, thanking him again for the kindness he had shown and asking if he might be willing to meet for coffee sometime. No obligation, simply a conversation. Ethan read it twice, surprised not by the request but by the tone, respectful and unassuming, and he set the phone down, considering. He thought of Emma's smile, of Lily's quiet pride, of his wife's patient hands teaching him long ago, and he realized that what mattered was not who had asked, but why. He replied that he would be open to it, that schedules were tight but he could make time, and he returned to his work without expectation. That evening, as he and Lily watched snow fall from their living room window, cocoa warming their hands, Ethan felt the same calm certainty he had felt at the dinner table, the knowledge that kindness did not demand answers or outcomes, only presence. Somewhere else in the city, Margaret closed her laptop and turned off the lights, resolved to make space for more moments like the one she had witnessed, understanding now that leadership and love shared a common language, one spoken quietly, with patience, and with the humility to listen. The days that followed settled into a quiet pattern, ordinary on the surface yet subtly altered, as if a new current ran beneath Ethan's routines, and when the morning of the coffee meeting arrived, he did not dress with ambition or anxiety, only care, choosing a clean sweater and his usual jacket, the one that carried no story except that it kept him warm. He walked Lily to school first, kneeling to zip her coat and reminding her to listen to her teacher, and she asked if he was going to see Emma again, her tone hopeful rather than curious. Ethan told her yes, maybe for a little while, and Lily smiled, satisfied, waving as she joined her classmates. The cafe Margaret had chosen was small and unassuming, tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner, the kind of place that smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon and encouraged conversation rather than spectacle. Ethan arrived a few minutes early, ordered a simple coffee, and took a seat near the window, watching people pass by, hands tucked into pockets against the cold. When Margaret entered, there was no entourage, no sharp heels announcing authority, just a woman in a wool coat, her hair pulled back, scanning the room until her eyes found him. She smiled, genuine and unguarded, and approached, thanking him again for meeting, her voice softer than it had been at the dinner. They spoke at first about small things, the weather, the holidays, the way the city felt quieter after a snowfall, and Ethan noticed how carefully she listened, not interrupting, not steering the conversation, as if she were practicing a new skill. Eventually, she spoke about Emma, about how difficult it had been to watch her daughter retreat into herself at events meant to celebrate togetherness, about the guilt that came with realizing success did not translate into understanding. Ethan did not offer solutions, he rarely did. He simply listened, nodding, his presence steady, and when Margaret asked how he had learned to be so patient, he spoke of his wife again, of lessons learned not through instruction but through example, of the power of waiting long enough for someone else to finish their thought. Their conversation was interrupted briefly when a man at a nearby table recognized Margaret, whispering to his companion, glancing over with interest that quickly edged toward intrusion. Margaret noticed too, her posture tightening out of habit, and Ethan saw the familiar walls begin to rise. He did not comment on it. Instead, he shifted the conversation back to Emma, signing a small phrase unconsciously as he described how children often express themselves more freely when they felt safe. Margaret caught the movement, surprised, and smiled faintly, the tension easing as she followed his lead, choosing not to acknowledge the attention. When they stood to leave, Margaret thanked him once more, this time not as a CEO but as a mother, telling him that Emma had asked every day since the dinner if she could see him and Lily again. Ethan felt a flicker of concern, not fear, but awareness of boundaries, and he answered honestly, saying that he was open to it as long as it felt right for everyone, that children deserved consistency more than excitement. Margaret agreed immediately, appreciating the care behind his words, and they parted with a quiet understanding rather than a plan. That evening, Emma signed excitedly to her mother that she wanted to invite Lily over to see her snow globes, and Margaret said yes without hesitation, arranging a simple afternoon, no staff, no schedule. When the day came, Ethan and Lily arrived at Margaret's home, surprised by its size but not intimidated, and Emma greeted them at the door, her smile immediate and bright. The girls disappeared into a world of glittering snow and quiet laughter, and Ethan and Margaret watched from a distance, the space between them comfortable, unforced. At one point, a comment from a passerby outside the gate drifted in, a careless remark about status and difference, and Margaret stiffened, ready to respond, but Ethan met her eyes and shook his head gently, choosing silence over confrontation. She followed his lead, letting the moment pass, and in that shared restraint, something settled into place. It was not romance or reward, not yet, but respect, earned not through power or generosity, but through the steady practice of dignity. And as the afternoon light faded and the girls' laughter echoed softly through the house, both adults understood that what had begun at a Christmas dinner was becoming something stronger, something built not on noise or recognition, but on the quiet decision to keep showing up. The weeks unfolded with a quiet steadiness, and what had begun as a single moment of connection slowly wove itself into the fabric of everyday life, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Emma and Lily saw each other often now, sometimes at Margaret's home, sometimes at the small park near Ethan's apartment, bundled in coats, sharing snacks, communicating through a mix of laughter, gestures, and signs that Lily was learning eagerly, her hands clumsy but determined. Ethan watched with a familiar mix of pride and protectiveness, careful never to push, always letting the rhythm set itself, and Margaret noticed how different this felt from the structured playdates she had once arranged, where every minute had been planned and supervised. Here, the girls simply existed together, and that was enough. One afternoon, as the girls sat on the living room floor surrounded by snow globes and sketchbooks, Emma signed something that made Lily pause, her brow furrowing as she tried to understand. Ethan moved instinctively, kneeling beside them, repeating the sign slowly, breaking it down, giving Lily time, and when Lily finally got it right, Emma clapped silently, her joy unmistakable. Margaret watched from across the room, her chest tightening with emotion, realizing that she had never before seen her daughter celebrated so openly for being understood. Later that evening, after the girls had grown quiet with fatigue, Margaret and Ethan sat at the kitchen table, mugs of tea between them, speaking softly. Margaret admitted that the company board had questioned her recent choices, her reduced travel, her insistence on inclusive practices that went beyond compliance and into culture. She spoke of subtle resistance, of raised eyebrows and polite objections, and Ethan listened, recognizing the familiar discomfort that came when values challenged convenience. He did not advise her to fight harder or to compromise. He simply said that change took time, that people listened more when they felt respected rather than forced, and Margaret found unexpected comfort in the simplicity of his perspective. The following week, at a holiday charity event hosted by the company, Margaret invited Ethan and Lily to attend, not as guests of honor, but as participants, and Ethan hesitated before agreeing, aware of the scrutiny that came with such spaces. When they arrived, dressed simply, hands linked, the room buzzed with conversation, and a few familiar looks surfaced, curiosity mixed with judgment. During the program, a presenter made an offhand remark about accessibility, well-meaning but shallow, and Ethan felt the tension ripple through the audience. Emma, seated beside her mother, signed quickly, her expression serious, and Margaret stood without hesitation, addressing the room, sharing briefly about her daughter, about the difference between accommodation and inclusion, and as she spoke, she signed alongside her words, her movements deliberate and sincere. The room grew quiet not out of obligation but attention, and Ethan felt a deep respect settle over him, seeing her choose presence over polish. Afterward, several attendees approached Emma directly, signing awkwardly, smiling, trying, and Emma responded with patience, her confidence unmistakable. One man, influential and dismissive earlier, muttered something under his breath about special treatment, and Ethan caught it, his jaw tightening instinctively, but Margaret heard it too and simply met the man's gaze, steady and calm, saying that dignity was not a favor, it was a baseline. There was no applause, no confrontation, just silence, and in that silence, the comment lost its power. As the evening ended and coats were gathered, Ethan felt the familiar pull to leave quietly, but Emma signed to him before he could go, thanking him for teaching Lily to understand her world, and Ethan signed back that Emma was teaching them all. Walking home under the cold night sky, Lily asked why some people seemed uncomfortable when others were different, and Ethan answered honestly, saying that sometimes people feared what reminded them to change. Lily thought about this, then said she liked learning signs because it made her feel closer to people, and Ethan smiled, knowing that the quiet lessons of the past weeks were taking root. Somewhere between shared afternoons and small acts of courage, the lines that had once separated their lives were fading, replaced by something sturdier than charity or coincidence, a shared commitment to respect, practiced daily, spoken softly, and felt deeply even when no one was watching. The season moved quietly toward its close, decorations coming down, routines returning, and yet the change that had begun on a winter night did not fade with the lights. On a clear afternoon near the end of winter break, Ethan stood at the edge of the small park with a cup of coffee warming his hands, watching Lily and Emma sit side by side on the swings, their boots brushing the frozen ground as they signed back and forth, laughter spilling out in ways that did not need sound. Other parents watched from benches, some curious, some thoughtful, and a few children wandered closer, asking questions, mimicking hand movements, learning without instruction. Ethan did not guide them, he simply allowed the moment to exist. Margaret arrived a little late, coat draped over her arm, and stopped when she saw the scene, her expression softening into something that no boardroom victory had ever given her. She stood beside Ethan without announcement, the two of them sharing the silence comfortably, and she said quietly that she had been invited to speak at a national conference about leadership and innovation. Ethan nodded, listening, and she added that she planned to talk about listening, about dignity, about the night a stranger had reminded her what inclusion really meant. Ethan responded simply that sometimes the most important lessons came from paying attention to the people right in front of you. Margaret smiled at that, recognizing the truth she had come to respect. When it was time to leave, Emma signed goodbye to Lily with exaggerated care, promising to practice more signs, and Lily hugged her without hesitation, an instinctive gesture that spoke for itself. As Ethan and Lily walked home, Lily asked if everyone could learn sign language, and Ethan answered that anyone could if they were willing to slow down and learn, that understanding was a choice more than a skill. Lily nodded thoughtful, then said she liked the way hands could say things mouths could not, and Ethan felt a quiet pride settle into him, the kind that asked for nothing more. Later that evening, as snow began to fall again, Ethan tucked Lily into bed, listening as she practiced a few signs in the air, her small hands deliberate, and when she fell asleep, he sat alone for a moment, reflecting on how a life built on modest means had grown richer without warning. Across town, Margaret helped Emma prepare for bed, watching as her daughter carefully placed her snow globe on the nightstand, shaking it once, watching the flakes drift, and signing that she felt safe and happy. Margaret signed back that she loved her, that she would always try to listen better, and Emma smiled, content. In the quiet that followed, Margaret thought about the power she held and the responsibility that came with it, understanding now that influence was not about being seen, but about seeing others. Days later, a short message arrived on Ethan's phone, not an invitation or a reward, just a note of gratitude, telling him that Emma had stood in front of her class and introduced herself confidently, hands moving clearly, her classmates watching with respect. Ethan read it once, then set the phone down, the meaning settling into him slowly. He did not need recognition, did not need confirmation, because he had already felt it in the moment when a child's face had lit up, when silence had turned into connection. And so the story did not end with applause or wealth or transformation measured in headlines, but with something quieter and far more enduring. A single father used sign language at a Christmas dinner, and a deaf child smiled, and in that exchange, the world shifted just enough to remind everyone who noticed that dignity does not announce itself, kindness does not demand credit, and the most powerful changes often arrive softly, carried on the hands of someone willing to listen. Spring arrived quietly, the kind that crept in without ceremony, melting the last patches of snow and replacing them with pale green shoots along the sidewalks, and life continued its steady rhythm for everyone involved, changed but not disrupted. Ethan still woke before dawn, still packed lunches, still walked Lily to school when he could, his days measured in small responsibilities and quiet victories. Yet something within him had settled, a deeper assurance that the way he lived mattered, even when no one was watching. Lily had become fluent enough in sign language to hold simple conversations now, her hands confident, her face expressive, and she used it freely at school, teaching classmates, helping a new student feel less alone, her kindness spreading naturally, unforced. Teachers noticed, parents mentioned it, but Ethan only smiled when he heard, knowing exactly where it came from. One afternoon, the school hosted a small assembly about inclusion, nothing grand, just a few students sharing experiences, and Emma stood at the front with her interpreter beside her, signing clearly, confidently, her posture straight as she spoke about how it felt to be heard for the first time without asking. Ethan sat in the back row beside Margaret, neither of them drawing attention, and when the room fell into a respectful silence at the end, it was not the awkward kind, but the thoughtful kind that lingered. Margaret did not clap immediately. She watched her daughter instead, pride and humility mixing in her expression, understanding now that leadership at home mattered more than leadership anywhere else. Afterward, a few parents approached Ethan, thanking him, asking where he had learned, how they could help their own children learn, and he answered kindly, pointing them toward resources, never positioning himself as anything more than a participant in something shared. Margaret noticed this too, the way he redirected attention away from himself, and it reinforced what she had come to admire most about him. Months later, at another company gathering, much smaller and far less formal, Margaret introduced a new initiative focused on accessibility and communication, crediting no individual, only the idea that listening was a responsibility, not a courtesy. The room accepted it without resistance this time, the culture already shifting, and Ethan watched from the side, content to remain unseen. Emma found him afterward, signing that she wanted to become a teacher someday, maybe one who helped children learn to talk with their hands. And Ethan signed back that she would be wonderful at it, his certainty absolute. As summer approached, the girls spent long afternoons together, chalk drawings on sidewalks, shared popsicles, quiet games that did not require explanation, and the adults learned to coexist without expectations, their connection built on mutual respect rather than need. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden transformations, just a steady unfolding of trust and understanding. One evening, as the sun set late and warm, Ethan sat on the front steps of his building, watching Lily trace shapes in the air, practicing signs she had learned that day, and he thought about how little it had taken to change the direction of so many lives. No money exchanged, no recognition sought, no power asserted. Just a father choosing to speak in a language that welcomed someone in. Somewhere else, Emma shook her snow globe one last time before placing it carefully on a shelf, the flakes drifting slowly, silently, and she smiled, knowing that silence was no longer something that separated her from the world. And so the story found its ending not in celebration, but in continuation, a reminder that dignity does not arrive with fanfare, that kindness rarely announces itself, and that sometimes the most lasting miracles begin with a single, Quiet choice made by someone who expected nothing in return except the simple grace of being understood. Time continued its quiet work, smoothing the edges of what had once felt extraordinary until it became simply part of life, and yet the meaning never faded. By early autumn, the city had shifted again, leaves turning amber and red, mornings crisp, afternoons warm enough for open windows, and Ethan found himself sitting on a wooden bench outside Lily's school, waiting for dismissal, watching children spill into the yard with backpacks bouncing and voices overlapping. Lily ran toward him, signing excitedly about her day, about a new student who was shy, about how she showed her a few signs and made her laugh, and Ethan listened with the same calm attention he always had, nodding, encouraging, never interrupting. Nearby, Emma stood with her class, her interpreter present but unused for the moment as she signed easily with two classmates, their hands moving awkwardly but sincerely, and Margaret watched from a distance, her expression peaceful, no longer scanning for problems, only observing growth. She joined Ethan on the bench, greeting him warmly, and they spoke about ordinary things, homework schedules, weather changes, upcoming school events, their conversation unremarkable to anyone passing by, and that was exactly what made it meaningful. The world had not rearranged itself around them, they had simply learned how to exist within it more honestly. Later that month, the school hosted a community night, families gathering in the gymnasium, folding chairs set up beneath banners celebrating diversity and kindness, and Lily stood on a small stage with a group of children, signing along as another student spoke aloud, the two languages moving together, equal and respected. The audience watched quietly, some wiping away tears they did not expect, others simply sitting still, absorbing the moment, and Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not pride alone, but gratitude for the chain of choices that had led here. Margaret stood beside him, her hands clasped, and when applause finally came, it was warm but restrained, appropriate to the dignity of what had been shared. Afterward, as families mingled, a parent approached Ethan hesitant, admitting that she had never considered how isolating the world could be for a child who experienced it differently. And Ethan answered gently, telling her that awareness was a beginning, not a conclusion, and she thanked him, already thinking aloud about changes she could make. Emma found Lily and hugged her, then signed a thank you that was just for Ethan, telling him that she did not feel small anymore, that she felt seen even when the room was loud. And Ethan signed back that she always had been, that sometimes the world just needed help catching up. As the evening wound down and chairs were folded away, Margaret lingered, watching the gym empty, understanding that the greatest shifts rarely announced themselves with headlines or ceremonies, but arrived quietly, through repeated acts of respect. Weeks later, on a cool evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, helping Lily with homework, the sound of pencils scratching and pages turning filling the room, and he thought back to the Christmas dinner that had started it all, the moment when he had lifted his hands without expectation. He understood now that the true ending of that night was not a smile, not recognition, not opportunity, but continuity. A line drawn forward through daily life, carried by children who would move through the world with more patience than the one they inherited. Somewhere across the city, Emma practiced a presentation in front of a mirror, hands steady, expression confident, and Margaret watched from the doorway, quiet pride in her eyes, grateful for the reminder that strength could be gentle. And so the story closed not with a final scene, but with an ongoing truth, that dignity grows when it is shared, that kindness multiplies when it is unremarked, and that a single father choosing to speak with his hands at a Christmas dinner had helped rewrite the silence, not by breaking it, but by honoring it. Winter returned again, not with the sharp surprise of before, but with a gentler confidence, as if the year itself had learned something and carried it forward. Another December arrived, lights strung across the same streets, windows glowing warm against the early darkness, and Ethan found himself once more at a small kitchen table, helping Lily cut paper snowflakes, their shapes uneven and perfect. Lily signed as she worked, narrating her thoughts without realizing it, her hands moving as naturally as her voice once had, and Ethan watched with a quiet smile, aware that this had become their shared language, woven into daily life without effort. Across the city, Emma stood beside her mother at a modest holiday gathering hosted at a community center, rather than a corporate hall, her choice, her request, and Margaret honored it without question. Emma signed easily with volunteers and children alike, her confidence settled, no longer fragile, and Margaret observed how differently she carried herself now, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, fully present. When someone asked Emma where she learned to sign so well, she smiled and signed that she had always known, but that she learned how important it was when someone chose to use it with her. and the simplicity of her answer left the listener quiet. Later that evening, Ethan and Lily arrived, invited not as guests of importance, but as friends, and the reunion was effortless, the girls greeting each other with practiced signs and laughter that needed no translation. There were no speeches, no acknowledgments, no moments designed to impress, just shared food, gentle music, and conversation that moved at a human pace. At one point, a man nearby remarked casually that it was remarkable how one small action could ripple outward, and Ethan responded softly that most things that mattered began that way, unnoticed. Margaret overheard and nodded, understanding now that leadership did not always look like direction. Sometimes it looked like restraint. As the night wound down and coats were pulled on, snow beginning to fall once more, Emma paused before leaving and signed something carefully to Ethan, thanking him again, not for teaching her sign language, but for reminding the world to slow down. Ethan answered with a smile, signing back that she had done the same for him, and Lily watched, absorbing the exchange, learning without being told. Walking home through the quiet streets, Lily asked if next Christmas would be the same, and Ethan answered honestly that things would change, as they always did, but that the important parts would stay if they chose to carry them. Lily thought about this, then signed that she would, and Ethan believed her. In the weeks that followed, the season passed as seasons do, but the lesson endured, carried in classrooms, living rooms, boardrooms, and playgrounds not as a story told loudly, but as a practice repeated quietly. And so the ending did not belong to one night or one dinner, but to a way of moving through the world that asked little and offered much. A single father once used sign language at a Christmas dinner, and a deaf child smiled, and because neither of them sought attention, the attention found what truly mattered. In a world that often rewards noise, they chose dignity, and in doing so, they left behind something far more lasting than applause, a reminder that grace speaks most clearly when it does not raise its voice. The story came to rest not with a closing scene, but with a truth that continued to breathe long after the last snowfall melted away. Years from that first Christmas dinner, Ethan still lived a quiet life, measured not by milestones the world celebrated, but by mornings shared, meals prepared, and the steady presence he offered his daughter every single day. Lily grew taller, more confident, her hands fluent now, her heart open in ways that reflected the lessons she had absorbed without being taught. She moved through classrooms and friendships with ease, bridging gaps instinctively, never thinking of kindness as something special, only something necessary. Ethan watched her become this person with a calm gratitude, knowing he had never needed to be extraordinary to guide her, only consistent. Emma grew too, stepping into her voice, or rather her language, with strength and grace, standing in rooms that once felt overwhelming and claiming her space without apology. She spoke with her hands, and her presence spoke for her, and people listened, not because she demanded it, but because she had learned to carry herself with quiet certainty. Margaret stood beside her often, not as a shield, but as support, having learned that love did not require control, only attention. Their lives remained different in many ways, shaped by circumstances that never fully overlapped. Yet the distance between them no longer defined what was possible. They crossed paths from time to time, at school events, community gatherings, simple moments that did not announce their significance, and each time the recognition was immediate, warm, unspoken. There were no speeches about the past, no retelling of what had happened, because it did not need to be preserved as a story. It lived on in behavior, in choices made daily. Ethan never thought of himself as someone who had changed the world, and he was right. He had changed something smaller and far more enduring, the way one child felt seen, the way another learned to see others, the way a mother learned to listen, the way silence itself became a place of connection rather than isolation. On a quiet evening many winters later, Ethan sat at his window, watching snow fall again, Lily, now a young woman, laughing softly as she signed with friends nearby, and he felt the same peace he had felt that first night, the certainty that dignity did not require recognition. Somewhere else, Emma smiled at a familiar gesture across a room, and Margaret watched, knowing that the greatest legacy she would leave was not written in reports or remembered in titles, but lived in moments like these. And so the ending returned to where it began, not with wealth revealed or power exposed, but with something far simpler and far stronger. A single father once chose to speak in a language of patience at a Christmas dinner, and a deaf child smiled, and that smile did not fade when the night ended. It carried forward, quietly, faithfully, reminding anyone willing to notice that grace does not arrive loudly, justice does not always shout, and the most powerful form of respect is often spoken without a sound. In a world quick to reward noise, Their story stood as proof that quiet dignity can still make everything stop and change.